Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? We'll begin with the way the number of cases of the CCP virus in America is growing exponentially. Last week we reported that it had reached a point over 100,000 in a single day. By this week, in fact the 11th of November, it's hit over 200,000 cases. This rate of growth is simply unsustainable. It's going to create problems. This is based on data coming out of the Johns Hopkins University. This leads to a total over 10 million current cases in the United States of America and nearly 240,000 deaths. Such a large increase in the daily cases is obviously going to create another problem. That is hospitalizations. Simply by virtue of the number of people infected every day, the number who are dying on a regular basis, you can anticipate a significant increase in the number of severe CCP virus cases. This is where we're getting yet another record. The number of people who have to be hospitalized due to the CCP virus is now over 67,000. More than twice what it was less than a week ago. Consider that we are seeing not only an exponential growth in the number of daily cases, but also a doubling in the hospitalization rate week on week at the moment. Now, both the number of hospitalizations and the number of cases each day owe to a variety of factors. One of the most simple is that there is wider testing and more accurate testing. This means more people are being picked up with the CCP virus than were early on in the outbreak. That alone does not account for the drastic increase in the infection rate. It does to a certain extent explain the hospitalization rate, although even then we're still stretching credulity. If we know someone is in a high-risk group, it makes sense to have them in a hospital. That way, if they do become a serious case, they can be treated more effectively. If we don't know what the illness is, we can't treat them, but they're also unlikely to be in the hospital in the first place. This is one reason why wider testing is both important, but also something of a double-edged sword. We've been saying this for quite a while now, and will likely continue to do so until it is officially announced. The only way to solve the CCP virus at this stage is a vaccine. There are a very wide number of vaccines currently being tested. One of these is by Pfizer. They, in collaboration with another company, have been conducting phase 3 clinical trials. Their vaccine has been found to be 90% effective in preventing infection. Now, this would be a prophylaxis, similar to how you might give someone the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. Much like, say, the hepatitis or HPV vaccine. This requires multiple doses. One initial dose, and then a second dose, 28 days later. In theory, at least, this provides an extremely effective coverage. And the company claims they could have 50 million doses by the end of this year alone. They could expect to have another 1.3 billion by the end of next year. This is when we start looking at covering the entirety of different countries and possibly the world in very short order. But Pfizer expects that they'll be given emergency use authorization by the last weeks of November. This means that possibly by December, they might be able to begin disseminating the vaccine. Of course, given the cutting-edge nature of the vaccine and the way it's been brought to market, there are, of course, voices that are objecting. Their trepidation is not unwarranted. We know that vaccines brought to market urgently are not going to be the best of the options available. That is because the initial products brought out are going to prove the principles, get the basics right, and then the researchers, scientists, and pharmaceutical companies can begin refining and making these vaccines better. One criticism in particular that is at least more important or more noteworthy than others is a lack of data, or more accurately, a lack of transparency around data. We know that Pfizer used a very large cohort. In fact, they used 43,538 people. Some of these received the 2 doses, some received 1 dose, and some would need to receive a placebo. This is all well and good. It's a massive trial, and it's shown to be effective, as they claim 90% efficacy since there were only 94 cases of the disease observed in their clinical trial. What we don't know is anything about the ages of those who were given the vaccines or the placebo, ages, sex, distributions, or what the 94 cases of CCP virus were actually like. This means that we might find that the vaccine as it's been made now is extremely effective for those who have no particular risk from the CCP virus, while the extremely old and extremely young retain the same degree of risk. This means we don't know what efficacy it has other than that 90% of the people in the trial were relatively immune to the CCP virus. This also doesn't account for asymptomatic carriers. As we've noted in past weeks, they can be a bigger concern at times than those who know they are sick. While still on the topic of the CCP virus, we should mention something to do with research, particularly the genomics investigation of the CCP virus. Genomics is, despite how widespread it's used, still a relatively young way of conducting research. The field's been around for the last 50 years compared to biology, chemistry, and physics. What we're finding is that some things aren't as easy as they were thought to be at first. One of the more difficult things, particularly looking at viruses, is where you have overlapping genes. That could be thought of as being very similar to babushka dolls, one inside another, and unless you know to look inside the doll to find the next one, you simply won't ever find it. It's a sort of trick, and particularly useful for viruses as they have much truncated genomes and need to make the most out of them. Being able to put one gene within another is a very effective way to do that. What's important about this is that the gene itself, called ORF3D, is somewhat responsible for the immune response that we're seeing. Specifically, it's responsible for the antibody response. And this could be particularly important if we're looking at particularly vaccines that are relying on antigen sites for an antibody to bind to. Depending on what's being used and how, it's possible something like this gene could be an extremely useful bit of knowledge to have, as it would be something that could be targeted more effectively and more specifically. That would be giving the body the option to have a stronger response. In other CCP virus related news, there's strong evidence that the virus was moving from humans to minks and then back to humans in Denmark. This led to the government authorizing a cull of 17 million. That is 17 million minks killed out of concern for the virus's spread. We've previously mentioned that there were other animals that had received the virus from humans, but that the virus had not been going back to the humans after infecting the animal. This one was different. It was a mutated strain, and it was able to infect animals other than humans, and then come back. This is not the first time that rodents have given rise to a significant risk as far as biological things are concerned in human history. At least theoretically, the bubonic plague came from the Far East, either in northern China or southern Mongolia, where it was growing on rodents in the wild there. picked up by the Mongols and trade caravans and carried into the mainland Europe, where it continued to spread just about everywhere else. The important part with this particular outbreak is where the Black Plague or Black Death was particularly notable for how it was transmitted. This one is less so. There are a number of mutations that are related to not just the ability to infect animals and then humans, but also the viral spike protein. That is what is more often than not being targeted by many of the current vaccines, and that could be a big concern. That's enough depressing news for now. Let's move on to something animal related but far less depressing. Gulls know when to come out to get the most food from people. If you've ever been to the beach or some other public place where they are prevalent, you will know that they know how to get food. They're not as stupid as some people might think. One particular study has figured out that the gulls know when school lunches occur, and that they track this so they can gain access to the children's food. More than just being able to take advantage of the children's food, the research found evidence that the gulls might be behaving in a more widespread and concerted manner. That is, they would go from one location, that being the park where they had access to insects, then the school, and then the rubbish dump. That is, they would move from one location to the other in a particular and predictable pattern to take most advantage of the urban environment and the way humans were behaving within it. Gulls aren't the only thing this week that are proving disconcertingly more than they should be. In America, one hornet nest had more than 200 queens in it. Within a hornet nest, the queen is the only one that reproduces. In the US, there's a particular variety of hornet known as the murder hornet that is extremely aggressive and also extremely invasive. Of the queens that were fully developed, 78 of them look to be ready to go off, become fertilized, and create hives of their own. There were another 100 and some that were encapsulated and waiting to grow to full size. The giant Asian hornet or murder hornet is not necessarily a danger to humans, although its sting is especially unpleasant. The concern is the damage it can do to local bee populations, where it is very competitive. Killing these bees would be bad for the bee honey industry, but also for local flora and fauna. While on the topic of flora and fauna, we should talk about the efforts to create an influenza vaccine using different methods to what we're familiar with. In this case, using the tobacco plant. Several vaccines and other pharmaceuticals in recent years have been investigated for their possible use as a genetically modified vector to create different pharmaceutical products. One of the more promising leads has been various vaccines. In this case, they were looking at an influenza vaccine, and there were 2 clinical trials. Each of these had their participants, and combined there were nearly 23,000 people. The results of this particular clinical trial would indicate that the tobacco plant vaccine is comparable to current vaccines made with conventional methods. Over the last 2 flu seasons of testing, the plant-derived version has had equal or slightly better than results compared to the conventionally made version. This matches with the current year, where there was a much higher coverage, and also with the year before, where there was a much lower coverage, but that was also true of the conventional vaccine, where there were a variety of issues relating to the choice of which particular influenza strain to develop the vaccine for. The advantage to this approach versus conventional methods is timeliness. The researchers claim that with their method, they can begin producing doses of a vaccine within 2 months. In theory, it would take just that long to begin the system of producing a vaccine. That is, either using eggs or cell culture, but nowhere near an industrial manufacturing scale. When we're considering that these are plants, there is capacity here for a continuous yield that would remain steady over an extended period of time. Despite these strengths, it's likely to be some time yet before there's any sort of approval for these vaccines, given the novelty of the technology and some of the shortcomings in their clinical evidence. While we're talking about things that are not necessarily unreliable but unpredictable, we need to talk about the Arecibo telescope. This is a very, very large telescope in Puerto Rico. It's mostly intended to be a reflector dish that more or less absorbs a signal. In order to do this, it needs to be held together tightly, providing a smooth surface, in a manner of speaking, directing all that signal into a tiny point where it can be gathered up and measured. It doesn't help to do that when you have large cables that are meant to provide the structure breaking and tearing huge holes in that dish. The problem is that the location relates to the first break from back in August. The relationship between the two cables that are broken is the support tower they are attached to. It's thought that it might be possible that the first break increased strain on the second cable, leading to its failure. This may be the first signs of a series of breaks if the damage continues to grow, increasing strain on other parts of the structure. Fortunately, replacement parts are on their way, and hopefully they'll be installed before any more damage occurs. In other tech-related news, the Hyperloop has achieved a significant milestone in its testing. This time it carried 2 employees on board, and although they only travelled 500 meters, they did survive the trip without being turned into jam. This was one of the big concerns. When you consider that the vehicle inside the tube can reach speeds of over 1,000 kilometers an hour, the possibility of someone surviving that is quite small if things don't go well. We do have to question, with only a 500-meter track, just how high the speed got for the shuttle being tested, and if Virgin's Hyperloop can't reach the full speed promised, with people inside, there could be a significant issue with the whole selling point. For now, it looks like they're looking to get more money from various sources, including Richard Branson and other companies. They will also need to face the serious issue of safety testing once this gets to a much larger scale. Next, we have some interesting research into just how social media and big data is being used, and data in general. One of these relates to research into researchers and China. Professors within America are either being convicted of or pleading guilty to espionage and similar related activities. The problem they have is that they were receiving money from various government proxies, let's say, along with grants from the US government and similar. Some of the caveats to these grants, if you are familiar with the process, is that you need to declare any conflicts of interest. One of the conflicts of interest is funding sources that are not the US government. If you don't do so, and you apply and then receive the grant money, there is a good chance that you could get in a lot of trouble, not the least of which is having to return that money, which can be a not insignificant sum. We've also seen some initial research into interesting social media, or at least big tech, influence on what information is available to people. As you would or would not be aware, in recent months, big tech in America has been under the very, very careful and watchful eye of the US government. There have been a variety of things that have been raised, whether that is biased and partisan censorship, that is the availability of information, suppressing different avenues and publications, and so on. This has inevitably led to the different big tech companies making various promises and claims about their platforms. These include things like they don't interfere with elections, they don't suppress voices, all manner of things. The concern is based on recent research that some of these claims may be less than honest, and given that big tech CEOs have on several occasions recently been warned that they may be referred to government agencies for criminal acts or contempt of government, you can see how this could be an issue. If the research that's currently coming up would be proven true, that means the CEOs who testified before the committees on various things have lied, and lying to those committees is lying to Congress under oath, and that could be a big issue. While hopefully there'll be more information coming out on just what data has been found and just what exactly is being either made available or not available, we may not know for several weeks or months even, and hopefully it'll come out as a peer-reviewed publication. In the meantime, that's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you might have below.